Hello, and thank you for joining us for Door County Coastal Terrestrial Invasive Species Education. This is made possible through funding from the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program and NOAA. If you are just joining us, this is part 2 of a multi-part series talking about terrestrial invasive species. In this section, we will be talking about control methods. We will cover methods for both herbaceous and woody invasive species, various approaches, techniques, safety considerations, and a general overview of what comes after removal. Before jumping into any control work, it's important to think through what approach will work best for your specific situation. Not all situations are going to be the same, and that will affect how you go about things. First, you want to consider the size and extent of the area you're dealing with. A small patch in your yard calls for a different strategy than an acre overrun with, say, buckthorn. Next, you'll want to identify the species you're working with. This matters because different species respond differently to herbicides and different techniques. When you're removing woody plants in winter without leaves, it helps to scout the area out during the growing season so you know exactly what you're looking for. If herbaceous species are involved, species identification becomes even more critical because they're pickier about which herbicides will work for them. For woody species, though, about 99% of the time you can use the same chemical across different species. Then you want to think about where your plants are growing that you want to control. If they are in or near a wetland, there are extra regulatory protections in place that may require permits before you can treat them. Proximity to water sources, gardens, or other sensitive areas affect both method choice and legal requirements. Finally, evaluate your time, your budget, and your own physical ability. For large infestations, the initial removal can be very labor-intensive, and you may want to bring in help for that heavy lifting to get things started, then manage follow-up treatments yourself. Or you might decide chemical control is the way to go to save time and physical strain. There is no one right answer, and it really all depends upon your situation. The bottom line is, be honest about what you can commit to and choose a method that fits. So to start off with, we're going to talk about mechanical or manual methods for removal of woody species. Hand pulling works best for seedlings and small plants with shallow roots. Get it in early and you can prevent a problem before it starts. Digging is a little more intensive. You use a shovel or a weed wrench to remove the entire root system. This is effective but physically demanding, especially on larger plants. Cutting means removing stems right at ground level or very close to it. The advantage is simplicity. The disadvantage is that it requires repeated applications. Many woody species will resprout from the roots, so cutting alone is often just the first step, not a long-term method. Mowing is useful for large areas and can suppress growth, but like cutting, it needs to be done repeatedly over time to exhaust a plant's root reserve. And for woody species, usually involves having special equipment to do that because a normal lawnmower wouldn't be able to handle cutting down a woody plant. The benefits of manual and mechanical methods is there are no chemicals involved. The downside, they can be time intensive and most require multiple applications over a season or even multiple years. But if you have time and physical capacity, they're a solid option. Mechanical and manual methods for herbaceous species are quite similar to the woody invasives. You can hand pull small seedlings or plants with shallow roots. Again, you want to get in there early, prevent it from becoming a problem before it starts. You can do digging. Again, you want to use a shovel to remove the entire root system. It's very physically demanding for some species like grasses, irises, other things like that. Mowing is a very useful technique as well. For large areas, it can suppress the growth, but again, it needs to be redone repeatedly over the growing season because as you cut the plants, they do regrow within that same season. A different technique is smothering. So smothering is an effective method to get rid of unwanted plants on a relatively small scale. This process involves using material to block sunlight from an area for an extended period of time. The length of time will vary depending upon the species or what's growing in that area, but plan for a minimum of 6 months up to a year or two. One downside to this is that you will lose everything growing in that area, as it will solarize the complete area. More beneficial for starting a new garden at home, or where there's things growing there that you're not really worried if you lose it, some bunch of weeds, etc. Again, there are no chemicals involved with these methods, but they do take time and multiple applications. So just some general tips for success when it comes to manual or mechanical removal. When you're pulling, you want to pull when the soil is moist. It makes for easier removal, especially just after a rainstorm in the springtime. You don't have to work as hard. You want to remove as much of the root system as possible. Various species can resprout from very small fragments of root left behind, but it's just constantly coming back to watch for seedlings. If you are cutting, you want to do it repeatedly. Each time you cut, you're exhausting that plant's stored energy reserve in the roots, and eventually the plant just gives up. And then dispose of plant material appropriately. You don't want to leave pulled plants lying in piles where they might reroot, and just don't throw them in bushes. We'll talk more about proper disposals later on in this presentation. And of course, we want to keep a watch out through the growing season. So we're going to talk about some biocontrol. Biocontrol uses natural enemies such as insects, pathogens, diseases to suppress invasive plants. Before biocontrol can be approved for release and used to control invasive, it has to go under vigorous testing. For woody species, there has not been a biocontrol approved yet, but there is ongoing research. The University of Minnesota is researching biocontrol for a buckthorn using fungi. They're still in the process of doing this. It's actively going on now. They're in the very first stages of research. And also there is research for biocontrol for tree of heaven, which serves as a host plant for the spotted lanternfly. That one's a little bit further along in the research and shows some good promise. There are, however, a lot more biocontrols out there for herbaceous plants, so any flowering species. They are regulated by the state, so here in Wisconsin, the only one that's really used is for purple loosestrife. And a lot of times, these natural enemies are often, but not always, from the native range of the invasive target plants. One example of where a native species is actually somewhat used as a biocontrol is for European water milfoil. There are native milfoils here, and there are native creatures, weevils, that will feed on the plants. So this is a good example of something that's native already. It doesn't always go according to plan. There has been some testing done previously for a Canada thistle bud weevil, and it was thought during studies and testing that it would only target the native or the invasive Canada thistle, but in reality it ended up targeting some of our native thistles and has caused decline in some of our rare thistles that we have. So with purple loosestrife, that's the most common one here in Wisconsin, and it's been going on for many, many years. It does help, especially for large areas of purple loosestrife. Eradication is rare, but it does control the population to keep populations down. It ebbs and flows, so as the population of purple loosestrife expands, so will the beetles. And then the beetles do their job, and as the population of purple loosestrife declines, the beetle population will decline. So it's sort of constantly up and down throughout the whole season. So now we're going to dive into chemical control. There's a lot more to think about with chemical control. So one reason that you might do chemical control is you're dealing with large plants with extensive root systems. These root systems could be rhizomatous like goutweed or Canada thistle or Phragmites, or species that just really have a deep taproot like some of our non-native thistles or wild parsnip. You may also target areas that are just too large for manual removal. If you've got a half acre of invasives, manual control can sometimes become impractical. The chemistry of chemical control lets you cover more ground more efficiently. Chemical control is powerful and efficient, but it does come with some regulatory requirements and safety responsibilities that we will discuss further. Another reason that you might use chemical control is maybe you've done multiple seasons of manual control, and then with this you've weakened the plant system and it really makes it more vulnerable to an herbicide treatment. So maybe after 2 or 3 years of this manual control, you decide to do 1 season of chemical control. Or you may choose to do chemical control due to safety concerns. This might include dense stands of Phragmites that's blocking the right-of-way views, or dealing with things like wild parsnip, which can cause burns on your hand if you get the sap there. So this may be something that you don't want to necessarily do manual removal on. So some things to think about when you're dealing with chemicals. Private landowners can apply certain herbicides in upland settings to their own properties, but you must follow the herbicide label. The herbicide label is the law. Always read every bottle every single time. Even if the labels may change slightly, and the label on the bottle is always the law. If you are concerned about possibly being in a wetland, one way to test that is what we call the wet sock rule. Is if you were going to be standing where the plants are growing without shoes on, would your socks get wet? If the answer is yes, you are potentially in a wetland and extra regulations are required for chemical treatment with that. So if there are any concerns, reach out to your local soil and water department, me, or even the DNR before proceeding with chemical treatment. So when going about chemical treatments, you really want to select the best herbicide for your target vegetation. Not all herbicides work on plants, and you really need to choose the one that's right for what you want to use. Select the method and equipment carefully to minimize off-target movement. This means choosing nozzles and pressures that don't create fine droplets that drift. And then you want to calibrate your spray equipment. This is critical. You want to measure and adjust your sprayer so it applies the right amount. This proper calibration doesn't waste herbicides and minimizes the environmental impact. And keep a spill kit handy. Accidents happen. We don't want to cause problems, but just know what to do if something goes wrong. Preparation prevents problems. And you'll hear me say this a lot. Always read and follow the label instructions. So, you've decided to do a chemical application. You want to make sure you have the right herbicide for your target plants. This makes control more effective, saves money, and reduces harm to the environment. The most important thing is to determine if you're working in a wetland or not. Since there are extra regulations for chemical use in wetlands, it's important to know this. You also can only use certain herbicides in wetlands. Roundup, the typical stuff that people can buy at the hardware store, is not approved for use in wetlands, so you just need to have some cognitive information about what you're going to be doing. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the active ingredients that are common there. This is not a be-all, know-all, but I just want to give some background about the different types of chemicals. Most people are familiar with glyphosate. While it can be a useful project, there might be something better for what you want to do. For this, I'll just be using the active ingredient name, not talking about the brand names, because each active ingredient has multiple brand names. So we can talk a little bit more about that later if you are interested in knowing more. So glyphosate and imazapyr are both non-selective herbicides. Both products will kill most plants, and this can be good for areas where you have multiple target species mixed together or areas that you want to completely kill. But since this will kill most plants, caution is needed to not cause harm to desirable plants in the area. So this top picture here is a patch of Japanese knotweed that we treated in 2025. As you can see, there's pretty much nothing growing there. We used imazapyr there, so it did its job, but nothing's growing there, so now we can come back in and do a follow-up treatment to continue the work. The product 2,4-D is a selective herbicide towards broadleaf plants or forbs, so most of your flowering species like thistles, clovers, dame rockets, and wild parsnip. It will kill these plants but not harm the surrounding grasses. In other words, it won't create that large dead spot like glyphosate or imazapyr would. So we use 2,4-D for treatment of wild parsnip, which you can see in this bottom picture. You can see those brown, dying, curling up leaves, but the surrounding grasses are still green, so it hasn't harmed those. Clethodim is a grass-specific herbicide, so it will only target the grasses and not the forbs. This one is not approved for use in wetlands, so it would only be beneficial for your upland settings, but it is good to include for working in like pollinator areas where maybe you have some non-native pasture grasses that you want to get rid of to increase the flowering plant diversity. And then the last one we'll talk about is triclopyr. So this one is useful because it targets some woody species and some broadleaves like creeping bellflower or other persistent species like purple loosestrife. Like 2,4-D, it has little impact on grasses in the surrounding area. So we're going to talk a little bit about techniques for applying chemicals to woody species. So there are 3 common techniques that are used. The most common one is going to be your cut stump. For this, you want to cut the woody species as close to the ground as possible, ideally lower than 12 inches, and then apply that herbicide to the cut surface. So in this example, in the top picture there, you have a very large stump. You don't actually need to treat the entire stump, as it's seen in the blue circle there on the outside. That's really the only spot that you need to treat. The inner part of that is considered the dead wood or the heartwood. It doesn't really transport stuff for the plants. That outer ring is what is called the cambium, and that's really what transports the nutrients in the water. So hitting that area is going to transport that herbicide down into the root system and ultimately kill the invasive species. You can do a foliar treatment or a backpack sprayer. This would be done in any time when the plant has leaves. Typically, late summer into early fall is the best time as the plants start to absorb the nutrients back into their root system. So you're just going out there and are spraying the leaves of the plants. Good for follow-up treatment when you have a bunch of small resprouting things. Not really great for large shrubs, more for a safety reason. And then another option is called basal bark. So with this, you apply the herbicide directly to the lower 12 to 18 inches of the bark of the stem. You want to do it so the bark is wet but not dripping. And this method works best late summer through winter. You really want to avoid springtime for any woody species treatments for herbicide, as that's when the sap is flowing and all the energy is coming back up, so it's just less effective. Each of these methods has its time and place and just really depends upon the situation. So now we'll talk a little bit about methods for herbaceous species. We have our foliar treatment again. This can be done again anytime the plants are green, and it's going to vary by the species. Garlic mustard is great to treat in the springtime or the fall, but something like Phragmites is better to treat in the fall as the plants are starting to go dormant. There's a swipe treatment, also called the glove of death, which involves putting on a rubber glove and then over top of that using a cotton glove. And what you do is you have a spray bottle with herbicide and you spray your cotton gloved hand and you sort of just run the herbicide up the plant. This is really great for isolated patchy spots of like Phragmites or other invasives versus like using a foliar treatment where you're going to just be spraying indiscriminately. This is very localized. And a technique that's often used for Phragmites but can also be used for things like Greek canary grass is, I call it a bundle cut. What you do with this is you tie the species up with twine or something, you cut off above that twine, and then you treat that cut stem. It is relatively time intensive, but you're able to be very more selective about what you're treating and save the things that might be going around there. So just some general safety things to always consider when you're working with herbicide is you want to wear your personal protective equipment, or PPE. Read the labels of your herbicide that you're going to be using, because that will really give you an idea of what they recommend to wear. But in general, you want to wear rubber gloves, eye protection, and long sleeves. It's highly recommended always to wear that, because that's going to be your protection against getting any of these chemicals on you. You want to keep the area that you're treating clear during and after the application. You don't want to walk into an area that's wet with herbicide. You want to at least give it 24 to 48 hours for the chemical to dry before accessing the site again. Look at the weather. You don't want to spray on a windy day. That wind will carry the spray off, target plants, potentially harming plants you want to keep, or spreading the chemical beyond your property, which can cause legal issues. When storing your chemicals, you want to store them securely in a locked space, away from children and pets, and dispose of them properly. You don't want to pour these unused herbicides down the drain or into the ground. Again, follow label instructions, or contact your local waste management facility for disposal. So now we'll talk a little bit about the timing of your efforts, because timing can make a really big difference in how things are applied and the overall effectiveness. So for woody species, really can think about it as 3 options. So springtime is great for manual removal of small, like when you're hand pulling small buckthorn, small honeysuckle, things like that. Summer, if you are choosing to do a foliar spray, that's the best time to do it. When they're fully leafed out, they have their leaves, and they're actively growing. Fall and winter time are perfect for cut stumps and basal bark treatments. There are no leaves to worry about, but the trade-off is that these methods are often more effective when the plants are dormant. No matter what treatment method you select, you're going to want to follow up with those. With herbaceous species, it gets a little more complicated, because it's going to depend upon what you are dealing with. So this is kind of a broad overview of how I would go about something. So when you have identified what you're going after, you want to pick the best time to implement your control. Remember, when you're doing this for herbaceous or even woody, the goal is to always prevent seed production. So springtime, if you haven't, is a great time to scout for new plants, or hand pulling small populations or even large populations if that's the route you want to take. Good time to be doing herbicide applications for plants like garlic mustard or early season Dames rockets. Summer, that's going to be the peak season for control, whatever method you're taking. If you're going to do mowing, pulling, chemical, that's when the majority of our non-native species are growing, and that's when most of the work is going to be happening. Fall is that final opportunity for herbicide applications. So maybe you're targeting those rosettes of garlic mustard in the fall time to get that extra year of control, or you're going after Phragmites, or you're just doing a follow-up treatment on an area that you've already treated. Timing is always going to be essential. So DSYST has developed a sort of a timing guide for most of the things out there. This is available on our website, so you can kind of see when the optimal time to do the treatment is, and maybe the type of treatment that you're going to be doing. And it also puts on here the time that things are flowering. So, proper disposal. Again, it's going to vary depending upon what you're dealing with, but in general, there are 3 different ways to dispose of invasives. On-site disposal is an option if you have the space. If you're hand pulling smaller plants, you want to make sure that the roots are exposed to the air and not touching soil where they might reroot. Plants in general, invasive or not, they want to live. So if you pile them up, they're going to try to reroot into the ground no matter where they're at. When dealing with larger woody shrubs, you can create brush piles or leave dead standing material if you've done basil bark treatment, and this actually does create some viable habitat for small birds and mammals. These brush piles give them refuge from predators, which is especially helpful in areas that have been dominated by buckthorn or honeysuckle, and then once you've cleaned those out, you've left an open canopy, so they're able to go hide in there. Burning, especially for woody things, is highly effective if you have the space and meet local regulations. It completely eliminates the seed viability, so if you're burning things on the ground there, it's a great way to do it. And plus, it's just really nice to burn buckthorn or honeysuckle. It's very satisfying. You can also bag things for disposal in the landfill. This works best for smaller things, garlic mustard, Dame's rockets, things of that nature where it's easy to compact down into a bag. But it also can be a good method for like collecting fruits from buckthorn or honeysuckle, getting them off the site versus just spreading them around the site. And the big thing to think about is you do not want to compost any invasive plant material. Most compost piles cannot get hot enough to really kill the invasive plant material, so it's just better to not take that risk and potentially spread it to elsewhere. So you've done the invasive removal. Now you want to know, like, what's next? What do I do now? And this is going to just be a general overview because it is really going to vary based upon each situation. But the big thing to remember is after you've done removal, you're left with bare ground, exposed soil, and anyone who's done any sort of gardening knows that bare soil is just welcoming other unwanted things. So what you want to do is really focus on revegetating the area. Most plants are vulnerable in their first year or two, native or not native, so really trying to bolster the diversity and fill in these voids that have been created. So these plants are competing directly with these young buckthorn plants. This dense native vegetation competes for light, water, nutrients, which does two important things. It reduces the space invasive species can reclaim, and it cuts down on the need for additional herbicide treatments down the road. The University of Minnesota does have some really great resources out there where they have studied revegetation after buckthorn removal. But this can still be applicable to any sort of removal, barberry, honeysuckle, even herbaceous removal. Just filling that void is going to be critical. And then you want to have sort of a monitoring and maintenance plan in the back of your head. Invasive removal, unfortunately, is not just a one and done kind of project. You do want to really think about 3 to 5 years of follow-up management. I wish it was a one and done sort of thing, but plants aren't like that. Some invasives will persist in the ground, either from seeds already in the soil or from propagules blown in from neighboring properties. We'll talk about buckthorn as an example. Buckthorn seeds can remain in the soil viable for 3 to 4 years. So after you remove that first flush of mature growth, you are going to see a new growth come in the next year, and it may be a little daunting, but developing a plan and how you're going to deal with that is going to be critical to make it manageable for you. So really focusing on trying to create equilibrium, not really focusing on trying to eradicate it, because birds will disperse seeds from adjacent properties. So even if you've cleaned up your land perfectly, neighboring invasives can repopulate the site. So this monitoring helps you catch new growth early when it's still manageable. So I like this slide, especially this graphic, because it really talks about as time goes on, there's more, the area gets infested, there's more cost involved. So that initial removal is going to be challenging. It's may be a little overwhelming, but as you chip away at it and you sort of remove this, you reduce the amount of invasives there, and especially if you're revegetating a site, that's going to really help in the long term, because you can kind of think about going backwards down this curve to get back to where maybe you're in that containment phase where you're not having to spend as much time, as much money, as much effort to maintain something. If you can catch it early, that's going to be the far more beneficial thing for everything. And thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.